joining me today. As we observe the 75th anniversary of the surrender of Japan, I think it's important that we need to understand that the terms on which that surrender took place remain among the most contested issues of the war. The policy of unconditional surrender was, when it was announced in January of 1943, was controversial. It was the subject of heated debate in the final months of the war, and once the war was over, it became controversial again. Today, I'd like to talk about the policy of unconditional surrender and peel back the different layers of the controversy. My focus will be on conditions within the United States. So you can think of my presentation as a companion piece to the one that Professor Kawamura is making on Japan and Hirohito on Saturday. I'll begin by discussing the movement to modify unconditional surrender that developed in the early spring of 1945. And that part will take us up to May of 45 when Germany surrendered. Then I'll talk about the period between May and early August when the call to modify unconditional surrender developed into a full-blown public controversy within the United States, complete with all the features that one associates with those political disputes, including leaks to the press, name-calling, and even a conspiracy theory. I'll finish with a discussion of the debate over unconditional surrender that developed after the war and which continues to some extent today. So 3 parts. The early part goes in the early spring of 1945. The second part goes from May to Japan surrender. That'll be the longest part. And then the third part deals with the period after the war up to the present. Unconditional surrender was destined to be controversial because it was Franklin Roosevelt's policy. What I'm suggesting is that the story of unconditional surrender is about the resurgence of domestic politics in the United States during the summer of 1945 and about conflicting visions of the post-war world. So let me stop here for a minute and ask you what you think the policy meant and why the US adopted it as a war aim. I'll try to address your answers in the live chat after my presentation. As with most things, FDR had several reasons for announcing the policy of unconditional surrender. For now, let me begin by saying that that policy, which he announced at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, was a quintessentially New Deal program. Unconditional surrender was intended to be the first step in the eradication of militarism and autocracy in the Axis powers. Planning for the implementation of sweeping reforms in Japan began even before FDR announced the policy. The goal was to create an economically broad-based democracy in Japan. The planners had time to do their work. The Joint Chiefs of Staff thought it would take at least a year after Germany surrendered to defeat Japan. But as the war dragged on and Japanese forces were driven back across the Pacific, conservatives in Roosevelt's coalition government began to question the necessity of compelling Japan's surrender. They were joined by Republicans in Congress and the press. Winston Churchill also encouraged FDR to modify unconditional surrender by telling the Japanese that they could keep the emperor, and that would become the central issue in this controversy. Churchill was concerned that Britain would be left alone to face the Soviets in Europe while American troops redeployed to defeat Japan. Roosevelt's military advisors also hoped that something approaching unconditional surrender could be achieved without insisting on Japan's acceptance of that specific terminology. FDR held firm to the policy and rejected attempts to change it. FDR's death in April and Germany's surrender in May created an opportunity for the conservative opponents of a New Deal for Japan to urge modification of unconditional surrender. Undersecretary of State and former Ambassador Joseph Grew, former ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Herbert Hoover, the former Republican president, and Roosevelt's military advisor, Admiral William Leahy, all argued that Japan had been a cooperative U.S. partner during the 1920s, and it could be one again. Leahy, Stimson, and Hoover questioned the need for a full-scale occupation of Japan. And they predicted that American efforts to reform Japanese society would create chaos and turmoil and make the country ungovernable. That group argued that once the militarists who had hijacked the Japanese government were eliminated, the pre-war leaders, whom they called moderates, would steer Japan back onto the civilized path. The fate of the emperor was another point of disagreement between New Dealers and the conservative opponents of unconditional surrender. New Dealers saw the monarchy as a bastion of reaction that enabled Japan's business and military leaders to stifle dissent and oppress the country's workers. Conservatives viewed the emperor as a figurehead, but one who could be used to stabilize the country and Japanese society after Japan's defeat. In short, New Dealers believed that the sources of Japanese militarism had to be torn out by the roots. Conservatives thought some careful pruning would do the trick. Drawing on their lengthy professional service in the upper reaches of the government, Stimson, Grew, and Leahy believed they were better able to define the national interest than the politicians who were beholden to the whims of public opinion. Stimson grumbled that advocates of unconditional surrender derived all their knowledge from Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado. Hoover referred to advocates of unconditional surrender as a vengeful minority. Eventually, he would blame unconditional surrender on communist sympathizers who prolonged the war so that the Russians could get in on the kill. So there's the conspiracy theory in the making. Leading opponents of modifying unconditional surrender were Assistant Secretaries of State Dean Acheson and the poet Archibald MacLeish. They also included Roosevelt's personal emissary, Harry Hopkins, the head of the Office of War Information, Elmer Davis, and the China specialist who served in the Office of War Information, Owen Lattimore. To these liberals, it seemed clear that the monarchy was an antiquated institution that bolstered the reactionary elements in Japan and fed Japan's aggressive nationalism. Why, they asked, why were the militarists so hell-bent on keeping the emperor if he was just a figurehead? He must serve some purpose for them. Grew, Stimson, Hoover, and Leahy brushed aside those questions. By late May, with Germany defeated, they thought that a carefully crafted proclamation might convince the Japanese to surrender. The place to start was with a public modification of American war aims. The most important clarification, that's what they called it, was really a modification that assured the Japanese that they could keep the emperor on the throne. That clarification just might tip the balance in Tokyo in favor of the so-called moderates. But time was running out. The Russians were set to join the war in August. The American invasion of Japan was slated for November. Conservative advocates of clarification hoped that clarification would prevent the twin calamities of a Soviet occupation of Northeast Asia and a costly American assault on Japan. In late May 1945, former President Herbert Hoover met with the new president, Harry Truman, and advised him that he should tell the Japanese that they could keep the emperor as a constitutional monarch. Hoover worried that a continuation of the war would leave Northeast Asia open to Soviet conquest and sow revolution in Japan. He insisted that Hirohito was opposed to the war and wanted to surrender, but he was prevented from doing so by the Japanese militarists. Hoover argued that a pledge to spare Hirohito would rally the alleged moderates around the throne and remove the one issue that kept the militarists in power. For good measure, Hoover also suggested that Truman should tell the Japanese that they could keep their colonies in Korea and Taiwan. After consultation with his advisors, including Roosevelt's former Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, Truman rejected Hoover's advice. Hoover later complained that Truman had agreed to make an announcement on the emperor, but that the communists in the State Department had scotched the idea. So that's part of the conspiracy again. Over the next few weeks, Grew, Stimson, Leahy, and Hoover kept up steady pressure on Truman. Grew was at the White House so often he could have set up a cot in the West Wing lobby. Although Truman never asked for one, Stimson took charge of drafting a warning that would tell the Japanese they could keep the emperor if they surrendered promptly. That warning, what became known as the Potsdam Declaration, was drafted without reference to the atomic bomb, but when Stimson presented it to Truman in early July, he noted that it could be timed with the use of the bomb. Pressure was building outside the administration as well. Following a meeting with Truman in late May, Hoover encouraged Republican senators to take up the cause, and they were supported by the conservative press. Time magazine publisher Henry Luce personally lobbied senators to support a statement clarifying unconditional surrender. I should point out, Luce was the child of Presbyterian ministers, and he used to say that the Republican Party is my other church. Republican Senator Homer Capehart from Indiana asked why we must destroy Japan's form of government and then spend years in occupation teaching a different form of government. The Republican senator from Kansas, Kenneth Wary, and the minority leader, Wallace White from Maine, likewise called for clarification of unconditional surrender, and they questioned the need to occupy Japan. As Truman headed to Potsdam in Germany for the war's last summit conference, advocates of modifying unconditional surrender resorted to the traditional weapon of the bureaucratic warrior, the press leak. One of Hoover's confidants wrote in the Army and Navy Journal that Truman had been given a draft warning that promised the Japanese a harsh treatment if they did not surrender. But the warning also promised that a compliant Japan would be able to preserve its religious institutions, including the monarchy. According to the article in the journal, quote, liberals and New Dealers, end quote, wanted to execute the emperor. Others, according to the editorial, blamed the warlords for Japanese aggression and believed that the emperor did not involve our security and that the war would only be prolonged if we had to fight to destroy Japan's religious and political institutions. The story, which was given wider circulation in the New York Times, did not achieve its desired results. At the Potsdam Summit Conference, Truman deleted the reference to the emperor in the warning, and he substituted a vague assurance to the Japanese that they would be free to choose their own government once they had shown the world that they would never threaten the peace again. The Joint Chiefs of Staff supported Truman's move. Truman had several reasons for deleting the promise about the emperor. The most obvious was that he was worried about American public opinion, and the public would oppose any concessions on the emperor. Polls indicated that that was the case. But Truman also knew from diplomatic and military intelligence that the Japanese were insisting on the preservation of the monarchy in its current form. And that was only one of several conditions they had. Another one was Japanese military was insisting on its right to try its own war criminals and to disarm its own troops. And they also wanted to limit an occupation of Japan. Truman also knew through his intelligence sources that the Japanese were counting on American war weariness to bring the Americans to the peace table. Toward that end, the Japanese had built up the defense of Kyushu, the next target of an American invasion. And they had built it up far beyond what American military planners had thought possible. The Japanese hoped that another campaign of attrition, like the one that had just ended on Okinawa, would convince the Americans to come to the peace table. Truman also confronted a common problem that negotiators have. How do you indicate a willingness to compromise without having it interpreted as a sign of weakness? The last thing that Truman wanted was to find himself in lengthy negotiations with the Japanese while pressure mounted in the United States to bring the GIs home. Finally, Truman could feel more confident about ending the war on his terms because he knew that the atomic bombs would be ready by early August, which was about the same time that the Russians were going to enter the war. The Potsdam Declaration, as that warning was called, was issued on July 26th. It threatened Japan with prompt and utter destruction, but it also promised that Japan would be able to join the family of nations again. Back in the US, conservative commentators wrote that Japan should accept the generous terms of the declaration before you-know-who would enter the war and complicate things. Reading those comments, editors from liberal journals like The Nation and The New Republic worried that the Japanese would conclude that the United States was as anxious about the Russians as they were. That would almost certainly lead the enemy to think that there was a way out of the war by playing the allies off against each other. And a cartoonist for the Washington Post drove that point home in a cartoon titled Birds of a Feather. That cartoon shows two characters walking in opposite directions on the same sidewalk. Closest to the viewer is a caricature of a paunchy, cigar-clutching, long-haired congressman of the old school. And he's got "Our Russophobes" written across his ample middle. He's carrying a placard that reads, "Russia can't be trusted. We'll have to fight them sooner or later. Write your congressman." Across from him was a bespectacled and buck-toothed uniformed Japanese, and he's labeled Jap propagandist. He's holding a sign that reads, "Impossible for allies and Russia to stick together. Eventual bust-up. Make opportunities for illustrious sons of heaven to negotiate a soft peace." The Japanese was saying to the Russophobe, "Remarkable coincidence. We both work same side of the street." So you can see here that liberals, of course, recognized that or believed that conservatives in the United States were playing in the Japanese hands by raising concerns about the Russians. The Japanese dismissed the Potsdam warning out of hand. Contrary to what Hoover and the others claimed, Hirohito did not contemplate surrender. He sought peace, preferably one that would leave the monarchy unmolested and Japan's political structure unchanged. Rather than approach the Americans, Hirohito tried to buy Soviet good offices by offering Joseph Stalin slices of Japan's empire. The end came swiftly in a series of world-shaking events. On August 6th, the first atomic bomb was exploded over Hiroshima. The Soviets declared war on Japan on August 9th. The same day, a second atomic device was negotiated over Nagasaki. The Japanese government finally offered to accept the terms of the Potsdam Proclamation, providing they did not impinge on the prerogatives of the emperor. Stimson and Leahy urged Truman to accept the offer. Instead, the president authorized a reply that made the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government subject to the supreme commander for the Allied powers. That was a crucial distinction. Acceptance of the Japanese offer would have left the emperor's considerable prerogatives intact, and it would have thwarted American efforts to reform Japanese society. Truman told two Democratic senators that he thought Hirohito was as guilty as Hitler and Mussolini. He was, however, willing to let the emperor remain on the throne, but only if he served American war aims. Following the war, conservatives argued that the same arrangement could have been made if Truman had been willing to ignore the public's demand for vengeance and abandon FDR's unconditional surrender policy. That was not so. Hirohito became the figurehead that Grew and the others said he was, but only after he agreed to unconditional surrender of Japan's armed forces and the occupation of the Japanese homeland. Everything that followed, the disarmament of Japan, the reform of its economic and political and social institutions, the adoption of its new constitution, in other words, a new deal for Japan, all of that was preceded by Truman's insistence on unconditional surrender. So I'd like to stop here again and ask another question. Well, actually 3 questions, but they're all connected. Given what I've said about the debate over unconditional surrender, and keeping in mind the way the war ended, what were the benefits of unconditional surrender, if any? What, if any, were the defects? Taking all that into account, do you think Truman should have promised the Japanese that they could keep the emperor? Although the war had ended, the battle over unconditional surrender continued. In mid-August 1945, the Chicago Tribune, which was the sort of flagship publication of American conservatives of the isolationist school, the Chicago Tribune published an expose by Walter Trohan, in which Trohan declared that in January of 1945, 2 days before Roosevelt left for the Yalta Conference, FDR had received a 45-page report from Douglas MacArthur saying that the Japanese were ready to accept terms that were, quote, identical with the terms subsequently concluded by Harry Truman. According to Trohan, the Japanese peace offer agreed to make, quote, the emperor become a puppet in the hands of American forces, end quote. Trohan's bombshell was overlooked at the time, but it would resurface again. In the meantime, others were working to convince Americans that the war could have ended sooner if FDR and Truman had been willing to modify unconditional surrender. Like Winston Churchill, who famously declared that history will bear me out, particularly as I shall write that history myself, Herbert Hoover toiled to produce a revisionist history that would show that Japan was ready to surrender early in 1945. Hoover, it should be noted, was personally revolted by the atomic bombs, and he believed they were a moral outrage. All the more so because he thought they were unnecessary. Japanese officials were more than happy to help Hoover make his case. Hoover never finished his opus, although a compilation was published decades after his death. But he did get his ideas into print with the help of one of Douglas MacArthur's aides, a guy named Brigadier General Bonner Fellers. The article that Fellers published, titled Hirohito's Struggle to Surrender, was published in early 1947 in the Reader's Digest and also in the American Legion's magazine. Hirohito's struggle established what would become a foundational myth in the conservative critique of unconditional surrender, and that is that the emperor was trying to surrender all through 1945. Other critiques of unconditional surrender in this period were less partisan. In March 1950, Hanson Baldwin, the New York Times' military analyst, published a book called Great Mistakes of the War. Heading the list of the greatest mistakes, you guessed it, was unconditional surrender. Baldwin argued that that policy unnecessarily prolonged the war, especially since the US wound up letting Japan keep the emperor anyway. But Baldwin's assessment repeated Hoover's mistake. He mistakenly assumed that the imperial institution that existed after Japan's defeat was the same as the one that existed before it, and that simply was not true. Baldwin was motivated to catalog America's strategic blunders during the war because he was concerned about the deterioration of the US position in Asia by early 1950. In a few short years, the Americans had gone from triumph to tragedy in Asia, marked by the communist victory in China in 1949. The situation worsened in June 1950, a few months after publication of Baldwin's book, when North Korean troops smashed across the 38th parallel and overran American-backed forces of the Republic of Korea. President Truman responded by sending American troops to Korea. After the Americans rallied in autumn of 1950, the Chinese communists intervened and drove American and Allied forces back down below the 38th parallel. In the midst of this crisis, General MacArthur publicly criticized Truman's decision to refrain from attacking China. Truman responded by relieving MacArthur, and as Americans and Allied troops battled communists on the Korean Peninsula, Republican senators began to trace the roots of the current crisis back to the policy of unconditional surrender. Using what today would be called alternative facts, the senators claimed they had inside information that the emperor had been trying to surrender as early as February of 1945, and that Roosevelt had known that. Excuse me. During the Senate hearings that were held in May of 1951, following Truman's sacking of MacArthur, Republican senators and friendly witnesses began constructing the second pillar in the emerging conspiracy theory. This second part of the conspiracy held that unconditional surrender was actually a communist plot. Walter Trohan's previously overlooked article was retrieved as crucial evidence in this case. No evidence of MacArthur's supposed report was ever found, but that only confirmed the critics' worst fears about the lengths that Roosevelt's men would go to serve the Kremlin's end. So Trohan, the report he referred to, had vanished supposedly, and that had to be the work of communist sympathizers in the Roosevelt administration. MacArthur provided another piece of evidence by claiming that he had warned Roosevelt against seeking Soviet entry into the war against Japan. As one of MacArthur's more sympathetic biographers noted, that was a bold-faced lie. In fact, on 3 separate occasions after the Yalta Conference, MacArthur had encouraged Russian entry into the war. That didn't stop MacArthur's admirers from repeating his claim. So who supported this conspiracy theory? Most of its adherents were Republican holdovers from the isolationist or anti-interventionist wing of the Republican Party. Those isolationists had opposed American involvement in World War II because they feared that Roosevelt would use the war to claim dictatorial powers. But they also opposed intervention in the war because they feared that the Soviet Union would be the chief beneficiary in a global conflict. By the time the war had ended, it looked like their worst fears had come true. FDR, they alleged, had maneuvered the US into the war by provoking Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And then he had ignored Hirohito's efforts to surrender so that the Russians could enter the war, overrun Northeast Asia, and aid the Chinese communists. Unconditional surrender was the diabolical bookend to Roosevelt's Pearl Harbor conspiracy, according to these Republicans. That conspiracy theory served a political purpose for Republicans while Democrats held the White House. But once Eisenhower was elected, Republican internationalists dominated GOP. They had little interest in re-examining the end of the war, questioning the use of atomic bombs, especially since nuclear weapons now comprise the foundation of America's defense policy. Pushed to the margins of the GOP, the anti-interventionists interventionists kept the conspiracy theory alive, publishing exposés with titles like "While You Slept" and Elizabeth Churchill Brown's "The Enemy at His Back." And there's a picture of Elizabeth Brown there. Despite a sustained campaign to expose the tragic consequences of unconditional surrender, conservative critics were unable to sway the public to accept their views. The issue was disappearing from public discourse, and then something unexpected happened. Unconditional surrender began to receive scrutiny from a new group of critics. This time, they came at their subject from the left wing of the political spectrum. During the 1960s, a group of historians loosely identified as the New Left argued that Truman knew the Japanese were trying to surrender, but he could not let them do so until he dropped the atomic bombs. Central to this argument was the idea that Truman sought a delayed diplomatic showdown with Stalin, and to implement that strategy, he had to ignore evidence that the Japanese were trying to surrender. Strict adherence to unconditional surrender became essential to Truman's larger strategy, according to the New Left. This new thesis lacked the political support given to the conservative critique, but it matched the spirit of the 1960s by questioning authority and shifting much of the blame for the Cold War to the US. And there were some similarities between the New Left argument and the conservative critique. For example, both thought that the atomic bombs were unnecessary. But in other respects, the New Left critique stood the conservative one on its head. The big difference was that conservatives argued that a delayed surrender benefited the Russians, and the New Left said it benefited the Americans. By the 1990s, when the US was preparing to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, the New Left critique of unconditional surrender had become so pervasive that it was incorporated into the text of the Enola Gay exhibit. Some of you may remember that exhibit sparked a furious controversy. Conservatives were outraged by the exhibit, which argued that the Japanese might have surrendered if Americans made a concession on the emperor. You can see the cartoon depicting the controversy there. What strikes me about that debate is that neither side in it recognized how the politics of unconditional surrender had undergone a strange reversal. As the novelist George Eliot once noted, history does repeat itself, but not without a slight change of costume. And that was certainly true in the Smithsonian controversy. Suddenly, liberals were speaking lines formerly voiced by conservatives, and conservatives were reciting lines formerly spoken by the liberals. No one seemed aware that during the war, Republicans had been the strongest critics of unconditional surrender, and that they had maintained that a concession on the emperor would have ended the war. And of course, the authors of the exhibit's textual materials were blithely unaware that it was New Deal liberals and other progressives who had steadfastly defended unconditional surrender. That debate persists in more muted form today, and you can see that, for example, in Oliver Stone's sensationalist documentary series, The Untold History of the United States. Unconditional surrender has remained controversial because the policy was inseparable from the atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war. The way the war ended cast a long shadow over the post-war world. In retrospect, it's not surprising that the cataclysmic events that ushered in the nuclear age should also generate conspiracy theories like the ones I described. High politics, with its secrets closely guarded by a handful of privileged officials, invites conspiratorial thinking by those on the outside. Moreover, conspiracy theories, especially those that locate the source of the conspiracy at the heart of the federal government, have been a staple of our 20th century history, and I guess our 21st century history too. But I would add that unconditional surrender was destined to be controversial from the start because it was Roosevelt's policy. The debate over unconditional surrender extended the ideological battleground of the New Deal into the international realm. understanding that enables us to see how difficult it is to separate partisanship from foreign policy. And it reminds us that Americans did not abandon politics when they mobilized to fight the good war.